Hello everyone, in this video I will be going over the difference between a latch and a flip-flop using SR and D type latches and flip-flops to explain this. Firstly, it's important to note that latches are not used as much as flip-flops in industry. Why? Because latches are level sensitive. And when I say level sensitive, this is what I mean. When we look at timing in waveforms, if this is part of the timing diagram, where this is the time axis, a latch can change its output whenever either it's high or it's low. So for latches, the output, or when the output can change, depends on the level. But with flip-flops, when the output can change depends on whether or not it's the rising edge or maybe the falling edge of the clock or the signal, depending on the implementation of the circuit. So that's just something to keep at the back of your mind when thinking about the basic difference between latches and flip-flops. So to explain how to get from a latch to a flip-flop, I'm going to use the construction of a D-type flip-flop. Now, what you have here is your basic SR latch. When it's built with NAND gates, it's an active low circuit. That is, for this circuit to set, S has to equal 0. Why? Because when you think about the basic component of this entire circuit, which is the NAND gate, and I have inputs A and B. There is only one input I can make A to B that will guarantee me some output, and that input is 0. Because if A equals 0, then before, let me do it like this, A, B. I would have had A, B, naught equals something. Now I want to get 1. In order for this to equal 1, A has to be maybe 0. If this is 0 times B, this becomes 0 naught, which equals 1. And that's why this is an active low circuit. If this circuit was built with NOR gates, it would have been an active high. But for all intensive purposes, I will not be showing that, just to keep this flowing. So here we have our basic SR latch. Now with the functioning of this circuit, it's called a transparent circuit. Why is it called transparent? Because at any time, the output at Q can change based on S and R. So to make this, as you can already guess, the output changing so suddenly based on S or R can be a bad thing. So to make this less, to give us more control, yes, more control over the timing when changes can happen to the output at Q, we add enable. So to add enable, you just add another pair of NAND gates make this your S, make this your R, and make this enable. Another thing to note about this circuit in particular is that enable has to be 1 in order for us to get, and I'll show you. So, one other thing about this circuit is that it's no more an active low circuit. This is now an active high. That is, S or R have to be 1 in order for it to do its thing. So they're normally kept low. Then have enable as 1. If I pulse 1 into S, it goes straight in here, 1, 1, knotted becomes 0. Then the rest of the circuit can perform the function of the regular SR latch. But what we have here now is an SR latch with enable. So I make S1 and then it makes Q equal 1, and then I return S back to 0. Then, if I want to reset, I put in a pulse at R, so this becomes 1. Enable allows it go through 1, 1, 0, and then it does the rest. Still, well, actually, no. 0 here. So now, why the enable? Because if enable equals 1 equals 0, and these are still 0, even if I put a pulse at S, this becomes 0 and 1 knotted, and that becomes 1. And since this is 1, this won't store any value at Q. So it doesn't allow the regular part of the latch, this part, do its thing. That's why we have the enable. So we can take control of this enable and even replace it with a clock. Why replace it with a clock? Because a clock allows for more predictability in timing, because it's happening it's more regular in the time intervals. Because if we had left enable to just be enable, it's just some wire, it's just some signal, which we can have high for as long as we want. But with a clock, it has a regular time interval for each period and clock cycle. So what we have here is an SR latch with enable. Now let's go back to the SR latch without enable. To turn this into a D latch, why do I want to turn it into a D latch is a good question. Because when S and R are simultaneously 0, we have a race condition. Now, a race condition is when both NAND gates are racing each other to change their outputs. Because normally, if you set S to 0, we want this to be 0. No, we want this to be 1. If you set R to 0, we want this to be 0. So how does that work? That's an invalid case. That is the state in which you never want your latch to be in. So to avoid that, we have the data latch. Now, what does the data latch look like? This was S, this was R. All you do is you join them invert it on its way down to R, get rid of R, and change this to D for data. So now S S in quotes and R can never be the same thing. And that's a good thing because as I said, if these were both zero at the same time, you have a race condition, which is bad. And that's just what you have to know about race conditions for now. So let's go back to our SR latch with enable. That's wrong. SR latch with enable. I just explained why we have D latches. Because we don't want S and R to be the same thing simultaneously. Well, actually, not the same thing. We don't want S and R to be zero simultaneously. Because it's with enable, as I said, it changes it from an active low to an active high circuit. So we don't want S and R to be one at the same time. Same principle applies. So make it a data latch with enable. See what this does? Now, whenever enable is high, we can still have the same functions as with the SL latch with enable, but we will never run into a race condition. So look at this and you think, okay, so why do we need a flip-flop after this? That's where we have to start thinking more critically in terms of our timing. You see, with level triggered devices, it still has some unpredictability to it. Why? Because gates and electronic components have propagation delay, and propagation delay is something that we have to take into account for each and every component of our electronic circuit. And that is why, first of all, this would never be an enable because we don't want to like have control over that while the circuit is running. We want that to be clocked. And so another thing about a D latch with enable is that by careful rewiring of this circuit, of just the 4 NAND gates, this performs the exact same function as the one that was there before. This is still a D latch with enable, just wired differently and without a NOT gate. So now how do we get from this to a D flip-flop? Well, if I draw another D latch, or the structure at least of another D latch, To make this into a D flip-flop, all I have to do is connect the outputs of the first latch to the inputs of my second latch. But that's not all. What about the clock? I want to change this to a clock and invert it on its way into the second latch. Now what this would do is that it would make this one sensitive to when the clock is high, and this one sensitive to when the clock is low. Now, one thing to note is that in some places you might hear that this on its own is a flip-flop. In fact, it is not. That is a latch with enable. This is a latch with enable. And this here, the entire thing, is called a D flip-flop. Or a D-type flip-flop, or a data-type flip-flop, anyone you want to call it. But just know, you will see this being called the master-slave D flip-flop. It is, but do not be mistaken that this on its own is a flip-flop. That is a latch. This is a latch. The joining of two latches in this way makes a master-slave D flip-flop, or simply called a D flip-flop. For sake of this class, I call it a D flip-flop.